I could tell you about the exact moment I locked eyes with Sarah across the crowded bar and felt that spark of instantaneous connection. How her warm smile and infectious laugh immediately drew me in. But that would be the quintessential meet-cute story you hear all too often. The reality is, our love blossomed far more gradually, two young professionals just trying to make it in the big city. We ran in similar social circles, attended the same neighborhood haunts and house parties. Paths crossing again and again, feeling more familiar with each passing interaction. The lingering looks and casual flirtations slowly evolved into something much deeper. Before we knew it, we were inseparable. Sarah had this lust for life, this contagious sense of adventure that rejuvenated my overly regimented world of spreadsheets and tax preparating. Her spirit and ambition inspired me to finally start my own accounting practice. Meanwhile, she pursued her lifelong dream of opening a vintage clothing boutique. Concrete goals solidified, we made it official, a wedding at City Hall witnessed by our closest friends who had become like family. 2 kids soon followed, and we settled into a charming brownstone, checking off every picket fence dream. For over 15 years, our world seemed so idyllic and full of hard-earned rewards. That's what made the shattering betrayal feel utterly unforeseeable. Those early years were a whirlwind of hard work and even harder sacrifices. I was putting in 70, 80-hour weeks building up my fledgling accounting practice from the ground up. Missed birthdays, working holidays, the truly unglamorous realities of being an entrepreneur. But I did it all willingly because Sarah was the ultimate partner. While I brought in the steady income, she pursued her longtime dream of curating her own vintage boutique. That hole-in-the-wall shop became her creative oasis after our daughters were born. Sarah would spend hours hunting down unique vintage pieces, drawing up window displays, crafting the perfect warmly lit ambience. Of course, raising 2 kids while getting a small business off the ground proved immensely challenging. We continuously juggled the logistical nightmares of nap schedules, daycare, finding reliable sitters. But we overcame every obstacle through sheer perseverance and teamwork. And oh, were those daughters the lights of our lives once we finally emerged from the sleepless trenches. Funny how you spend those newborn days dreaming about when they'll finally talk, only to then wish for just a moment of silence once they become loquacious tweens. We baked an obscene number of cupcakes for bake sales, attended every school play no matter how torturous, and even learned to love Ariana Grande's insufferable voice. Our brownstone's walls were wallpapered with their innumerable works of arts and crafts projects. All the while, Sarah and I would exchange proud parent gazes, still functioning as a team united in raising our wonderful little ladies right. At least, that's what I had convinced myself of during those times. How desperately I clung to the illusion. The first red flag came with the increasingly late nights at Sarah's boutique. What were once the occasional inventory nights or displays to prepare for a big sales event slowly morphed into a near-nightly occurrence. She'd return home well past 9 p.m., long after we'd put the girls to bed, cheeks flushed and reeking of booze-infused apologies about getting tied up at the shop. Then came the more noticeable wardrobe changes. Gone were the breezy sundresses and sensible ballet flats I'd grown accustomed to over our decade of marriage. Now it was skin-tight jeans that hugged curves I didn't realize still existed, and lacy blouses that aired just a bit too much cleavage for an afternoon at a vintage clothier's. Her hair was being blown out regularly, makeup applied with markedly more intent than the swipe of tinted moisturizer I witnessed each morning. This wasn't just a self-care recharge, this was an overt attempt to be seen. But perhaps the most glaring indicator of trouble was the sudden guarding of her phone and social media. We'd had an open door policy with our devices for years, probably stemming from how blasé I'd been about leaving Facebook logged in and making myself an easy target for a gem of an embarrassing photo post from Sarah. Now, she carried her iPhone virtually attached, pulling it away like a flinch reflex whenever I entered a room. Texts and notifications went conspicuously unanswered whenever we were together. Her Instagram feed slowly pivoted from family moments to pouting selfies, clearly angled to highlight her physical assets. I'd be lying if I said the erosion of intimacy didn't sting just as badly. We'd gone from compulsive semi-nightly cuddlers to weeks without so much as a peck goodnight. It was like living with a friendly roommate I occasionally remembered to have married at some point. At first, I chalked up Sarah's changes as merely the byproduct of finally having some extra me time on her hands. The girls were becoming more self-sufficient teenagers, freeing up Sarah's daily routine in ways she hadn't experienced for over 15 years. I reasoned that running her boutique had always been her greatest passion project beyond motherhood. It made sense she would throw herself into work with renewed zeal now that the enormity of child-rearing responsibilities had lifted slightly. Deep down, I think part of me clung to that quintessential excuse of it's just a phase, because confronting the more seismic implications of what her behavior potentially signaled proved too daunting to face. Willful ignorance is truly blissful when contrasted with the alternative of dismantling the cozy fictional construct you've immersively inhabited for decades. I told myself her manic rediscovery of youth culture was merely an overcompensation for the domesticated rut of middle age. A last grasp at reclaiming her pre-marriage, yes-phase sense of independence before we inevitably surrendered to the realities of empty nesting. More than anything, I desperately wanted to trust her. To believe that the woman I'd built this wonderful life with, who once seemed like the only person who could read the inscrutable hieroglyphics of my very soul, would never actually betray the sanctity of our vows. That the increasingly blatant evidence of Sarah's altered state could somehow still be rationalized by inductive reasoning. She loved me, didn't she? We'd been through too much adversity together for this to truly be her unraveling our tapestry, right? In the end, the man who ferociously advocated on behalf of empirical data and verifiable facts for a living utterly failed his own moral vigilance when it came to the person who mattered most. It was well past midnight when I heard the telltale jingle of her keychain in the lock. Sarah stumbled through the front door reeking of stale cigarette smoke and giving off that all-too-familiar cheap vodka miasma. As she clumsily wrestled off her heels, I flipped on the entryway light, casting an undoubtedly harsh glow across her smeared makeup and mussed hair. Going for a new look, I deadpanned, venom practically singing my tongue. Sarah startled, then exhaled that signature drunken chuckle I'd heard endless times throughout our dating years, the same hollow sound that made my heart flutter 2 decades ago. Except now it was a relic, a scratched recording painfully dislocated and dripping with contempt. "Robert," she erred in a low purr, attempting to slink her arms around my neck. "Why don't you take your sexy briefcase stud self back to bed? I'll make it worth the wait." Recoiling, I shook my head and braced for whatever feeble excuses were inevitably coming. But instead, Sarah wavered on her feet before melting into a crumpled, trembling heap on the hardwood. He's just so much younger than me, you know," she slurred between racking sobs. "Kyle makes me feel like I'm still that crazy fun girl you fell for, not just this." The vomiting emotional purge came gushing forth. Apparently, Kyle was one of the younger part-time sales associates she'd recently hired at the boutique. What began as flirtatious work banter gradually escalated over the past 6 months into a tawdry fling carried out during the alleged late nights at the shop. According to Sarah, it was meant to just be a harmless reclamation of her long-lost youth, a moment of weakness, indulging the fantasy every 40-something Madre vengefully craves when staring down their remaining prime years. In that instant, it was as if the Tetris stack of my life, so meticulously constructed, brick by brick over 2 decades, spectacularly shed its form and scattered to entropy. Every accomplished multi-line clear, every intricate strategic build suddenly disintegrating to rubble with Sarah's drunken confession. The annoying 8-bit Russian folk song that had chirpily accompanied each of our triumphs grinding to a halt, replaced by the low-wearing ring of utter desolation. I'd always found the banality of the term gut punch to be reductive hyperbole. But in that moment, with the wind forcibly expelled from my body, I felt an almost parodic embodiment of the cliché. Each gasped inhalation only replenishing my lungs with the acrid stench of Sarah's perfidious deceit. My mind cycled through the well-worn litany of denial, mishearing, misinterpreting, perhaps some delayed hallucination of a previously redacted trauma. But she just stayed slumped there, mascara oozed contrails from her downcast eyes, void of anything further to say. In those first moments after the betrayal detonated my known reality into an anarchic ash cloud, I struggled to process the abject destruction surrounding me. My wife, my forever partner, the sole person I'd explicitly vowed unto myself to shelter unconditionally through every hardship, had utterly ravaged that sacred trust. All for what? Some pitiful grasp at reliving the sexual capriosity of her maidenhood with a zit-faced sales clerk she'd hired specifically to appease her delusional demi-moore fetish. I could never unknow that she had so carelessly discarded the life we built together like a meaningless inconvenience. Never unsee her being physically intimate with that faceless of **** boy, whose very existence would henceforth serve as an emblem of my most excruciatingly humiliating failure. Our entire shared history irrevocably tarnished. Our daughters' lives appended. Just gutting, scouring anguish. The days following Sarah's drunken unveiling brought forth a veritable avalanche of apologies and pleas for forgiveness. There were the maudlin greeting cards deposited at random locations, propped against my coffee mug, stuffed in my briefcase, adhered to the bathroom mirror with a contrite lipstick kiss imprint. Rambling voicemails and texts rapidly fired off in desperation whenever I failed to reciprocate her conciliatory attempts at contact. At first, I simply stonewalled. Couldn't even bear to hear the timbre of the voice that had so gleefully stomped upon sacred vows. Every justification, "it was just a mistake," uttered in that familiar dulcet tone, felt like a razored slash reopening the gaping wound. I avoided her entirely, leaving before she woke, staying out unconscionably late, just to reduce our chance encounters to blazing flares of farfalitical crossfire. Yet Sarah persisted with the inundating displays of contrition. The hallway became a minefield of meaningful lyric pages torn from dork lyrics books and romantic pamphlets printed with questionable verse. I'd arrive home to discordant candlelight vigils glimmering throughout the foyer, luminaries crafted from repurposed anthropology bags, and whatever shred of dignity she had abandoned. There were nights I'd awaken from an exhausted night's slumber to find Sarah curled in the alcove between my bedroom door and the wall, lashes disheveled and crusted from privations enacted to attain my forgiveness. Like a Rome-nominated performance piece, where the lead decides to not break character until the searing drollery of it all finally breaks you. No matter how convincingly Sarah shape-shifted through her rotating cycle of penitent persona, I could never again experience her with the same set of emotionally resplendent lenses. That saccharine-hued filter through which I'd viewed our relationship, imbuing every shared quirk and inside joke with profound significance, nuancing her mere existence as something to be cherished, had been irreparably shattered. Now, whenever I studied her furrowed brow, creased with performative anguish as she professed the desiccated depths of her remorse, I saw only artifice. Her plump lips, previously treasured flowers from which the sweet reverb of endearment flowed, were reframed as instruments for sculpting insincerities. Those expressive hazel eyes, once seeming to ethereally distill the entire cosmos into an enigmatic gleam perspicuous to me alone, revealed themselves as carefully practiced windows to an utterly deceptive soul. It became evident that no magnitude of contrition could ever unring the bell of betrayal. The trust, once shattered, could never be reforged as it once existed. So I began clandestinely documenting her movements through surreptitiously planted cameras and recording devices. Primarily for my own preservation at first, carefully cataloging her comings and goings to abdicate culpability should her feckless indiscretions directly imperil the safety of our daughters. But also, perhaps sideswiped by the same delusional arrhythmia that metastasized Sarah's ego, I indulged a desperate fantasy that I could reconstruct the breadcrumb trail that led us to this scorched terra in search of the elusive why. My pathological investigation didn't have to persist long before the cold reality slapped me again with full force. I was stuck working a routine week-long engagement in Milwaukee, the type of road out-of-town audit that had previously never given me pang of angst. Sarah had assured me she was taking the downtime to really focus on getting her head straight and beginning the healing process for our marriage. Part of me undoubtedly hoped the distance could reintroduce a modicum of that cherished novelty, the simple yet intoxicating joy of reuniting with your lover after a temporary separation. Instead, the crackly hidden camera feed I'd rigged to monitor our bedroom streamed undeniable footage of Sarah brazenly reoffending, contorting herself into performative positions completely incongruous with the domesticated passion we once charmed one another with, her voice arching into untamed, pornified moans of exaggerated ecstasy I'd never wished to hear in unlimited bandwidth. Admiring her naked form, the supple skin I'd adoringly committed every dimension to memory, draped and doted upon by hands that weren't mine. Hands that, judging by the prominent farmer's tan, were more accustomed to obscene gestures than caressing feminine curvatures. It was Kyle, the piece de résistance douche, making himself intimately at home atop the very same marital bed I'd sanctified through solemn oaths. The tousled sheets, imprinted with their indecorously intertwined body signatures, had been the chaste stage upon which we'd conceived both our daughters. An unbridled disrespect so profound that, even through the unforgivingly sterile live stream, I could practically smell the musk of their reeking mutual betrayal. Their actions represented a defilement that demanded cataclysmic repercussions, and I would oblige. In the days after being bludgeoned by irrefutable proof of Sarah's unfettered indiscretions, I found myself metamorphosing from my typical mild-mannered form into something darker, a sneering, eye-driven revenant silently napping obsidian arrowheads of resolution from the shards of my shattered heart. Yet as cathartic as these violent dissociative fugues felt in the thralls of their paroxysms, some lingering dapple of strategist clarity managed to pervade the crimson mists. Raw, unchecked retaliation would prove merely a Pyrrhic quick-release valve, allowing Sarah and her Sephora counter-attendant side piece to claim even the barest moral low ground. No, this called for a more surgical, purposefully glacial strike, a mercilessly protracted sojourn along the trail of tears until their utter demoralization was achieved. Too many paths lay underfoot to rashly start lopping off heads willy-nilly when I could sporadically disassemble them incrementally from the ground up. I had time and, more importantly, inconvenient truth on my side. With each passing day subsumed by the white noise of Sarah's bargaining and Kyle's desperate attempt at third-party mediation, my resolve calcified further. The idea blossomed from a mere invasive thought I'd instinctively swatted away to an all-consuming preoccupation. The closest approximation of karmic justice this fallen world could offer. Compiling the incriminating video footage was a meticulous process of excision and curation, coming through hundreds of gigabytes of the hidden camera feeds to extract the most salacious, most inescapably indicting sequences. Moments where Sarah's face contorted into animalistic rictus, utterly divorced from anything resembling residual spousal love. Interludes where Kyle's thrusting physicality betrayed the possessively territorial barbarism of his motivations. balancing the right lascivious to profane ratio in service of weaponizing the material for maximum debasement and long-term psychological torture. Then came uploading it to that virtual trust fall of a website, the sole platform still ethically unjustifiable enough to host such incredibly graphic content. Creating burner accounts, editing descriptive titles and tags to ensure the videos achieved maximum visibility through salacious searchability alone. But the real coup de grace was the automated link distribution, a fire hose of anonymized messages sending those obscenity-laden URLs to every adjacent social media connection within a 5-degree radius of both Sarah and Kyle's personal/professional spheres, ensuring that even their most tenuously associated relatives, business contacts, and casual acquaintances receive the morbidly tantalizing content with just enough specificity to make the identities unmistakable. I imagined throats agonizingly catching at their first unsuspecting glimpses of the footage, the inexorable momentum of gossip and prudence taking over as each new set of astonished eyeballs disseminated the filth hyperbolically outward, until eventually cresting in a towering tsunami of puritanical condemnation aimed to utterly submerge and drown them both. The shockwaves rippled outward with merciless intensity, like a contagion spreading through the dense circuitry of our hyper-connected world. Each new infection point seeded a cascading chain reaction of horrified recoils and sanctimonious condemnation. Within a matter of days, the videos had become one of those perverse viral sensations, millions of appalled rubberneckers indulging in the carnal car crash spectacle before frantically ushering it into the peripheries of their social media feeds. For Sarah, the professional immolation was cataclysmic. Her boutique's Google listing was promptly carpet-bombed with a pyrotechnic deluge of scathing one-star reviews, each one more decisively vitriolic than the last. Longtime customers posted damning diatribes about her reprehensible breach of ethical conduct, vowing to take their business elsewhere and encyclopedically detailing her most unconscionable offenses. The local community pages were awash in calls to boycott on moral grounds, decrying her as a pariah and lobbying for her societal excommunication. The vendors severed business ties without second thought, the lucrative clothing lines recanting their supply contracts in reflexive self-preservation. By the week's end, the windows were draped in blackout curtains, the doors shuttered, the dream she'd so meticulously nurtured reduced to ashes. I often wondered if she gazed forlornly at the burned-out husk of her former life's work in those final days before departing the husk of our marital home for the final time. If Sarah's downfall represented a lancing of the festering emotional tumors plaguing our community, then Kyle's immolation was the searing cauterization of the surrounding diseased flesh. The marketing firm where he commanded a modest mid-level position reacted with brutal overcompensation, not only terminating his contract, but leveraging the footage in an ill-conceived publicity campaign to bolster their PR credentials as a family-friendly company that took moral turpitude with life-or-death seriousness. Less than a week after the videos began disseminating, they had insisted on his signing a draconian legal gag order, while simultaneously plastering his face across billboards and bus bench placards in a hypocritical public shaming blitz. Coming home and seeing his gaunt, haunted countenance emblazoned under the damning header, "Our to Mehmet imi to etha kl Turehans Parency," while boxed in by the firm's gleaming sans serif logo, practically bludgeoned me with its delicious unirony. The avalanche of opprobrium that cascaded down upon Sarah and Kyle didn't merely bury them. It permeated every stratum of their previously stratified lives with equal oppressive impartiality. No sphere was spared the radioactive contamination. Friendships assiduously cultivated over decades withered overnight, as the revolted acquaintances distanced themselves from the moral leprosy. Former college roommates and bridesmaid confidants who once comprised Sarah's intimate sororal bastion now treated her as a virtual unbirthed untouchable. Her overtures met with icy silent treatments or toxically dismissive bromides weaponized to degrade. Within the insular confines of our sleepy suburban enclave, the blazing crucible of public shaming burned with merciless intensity. Sideways glances and disgusted sneers trailed Sarah's every departure from our home like noxious vapor trails. At the grocery stores, furious tutting and hissed maledictions issued from the clutched pearls of house-frocked matriarchs. Simpering golf wives hostilely dominated the legitimate gossip channels, scourging her with giggling insinuations and embellished improprieties regarding the sordid mechanics of her trysts. Even the most tenuous commercial interactions prompted cold recoils. The bank teller's plastic smile curdling to rigored contempt, the barista ostentatiously neglecting her drink order, the dry cleaner reflexively insisting on cash-only payment as if her mere credit line risked toxifying his EFTPO's machine. For our daughters Taylor and Mackenzie, the collateral psychic trauma was by far the cruelest injustice of the debacle. To have the inviolable sanctity of their parents' marriage, the embryonic blueprint that informs every child's first brushstrokes of object permanence, so profanely desecrated represented a primal shattering. The incalculable reverberations seeped across every psychosocial frontier in virulent, miraculous ways. At school, whispers and sidelong glances from peers metastasized into full-blown alienation, as the licentious allegations calcified into smirking contempt. Classmates snickered over the grotesque punchline of what lurked behind our home's facade, while teachers' reassuring concern carried the cloying reek of feigned detachment. Even extended family gatherings became gantleted bastions of reflexive pity and discomfort, the knowingly furrowed brows of relatives transparently suppressing therid fascination with the hairline fissures spreading through our domestic sediment. With Sarah's life lying in smoldering ruins around her, the inexorable legal mechanisms were set into motion. The proceedings unfolded with a sort of ceremonial formality, understated rituals portending the impending dissolution of our union after over a decade of intractable fracturing. The paperwork materialized first, austere documents couched in the anodyne juridical jargon that suffocated the granular complexities of our situation into a two-dimensional checklist of accountings and apportionments, checking little boxes to divide up our accumulated material driftwood like plundering vultures squatting over the cooling corpse. The consultations slogged onward in those interminable paper-hour increments, my attorney a tireless toiler marching me through the statutorily mandated paces, while sagely counseling the strategic compromises to minimize long-term liabilities. And strange amalgam of paternal assurances and actuarial triage. Sarah's lawyer, in contrast, oscillated between contrite negotiation and overt hostility, alternately pleading her case through empurpled caveats of mitigating circumstance, while baselessly threatening protracted litigations that could leave us both destitute, and flailed upon the putative whims of juristic caprice. The optics were carefully cultivated, I'm sure, each swerve between benign supplication and bilious intimidation calculated to rattle my composure. Our few direct exchanges through that barren corridor of hero departed months carried the funereal pall of an exorcism stumbled into halfway. Hushed tones and eggshells of hemming diffidence giving way to raw nerve emissions as the numbing analgesic of practicality wore thin. My eyes quarantined from her familiar features, noosing focus on beads of glistening desperation gathering in the crevices of her brow like quivering sacs of plague bacilli. Submerged beneath the aggressive detachment, I felt the distant thrum of empathy, an opposing tether still corded in the lightless deeps anchoring my roiling contempt to some primal bedrock of tendresse for this hollowed wayfarer before me. A lucid voice gently reminding that erasing this personal hieroglyph would lobotomize decades of my own histories and formative identities beyond the marital schism. With each round of negotiations circling the draining vortex, the videos loomed like a spectral kraken, an ever-present leviathan both parties assiduously avoided direct acknowledgement of. Sarah's counsel surely grasped the degree to which this obscene digital dossier had ruptured her moral standing. Any perceived escalation could catapult those obscenities into the immersive public stockade again, with potentially career-extinguishing consequences. Yet my surreptitious knowledge of their existence granted an insidious leveraging power that my own lawyer cannily milked with pragmatic zeal. The opening salvos were calculated feints, my team brandishing the most punitive onerous demands, like a bayoneted deterrent, meant to bait them into recklessly unsheathing the video's mutually assured destruction failsafe. A hyper-aggressive assault couching an endgame, where I would inevitably seize the marital home, primary custody, and virtually all material asset consolidation. Their retorts grew successively more bitter pills to swallow with each rejoinder until the subtext crystallized. Either they acquiesced to our terms, or we'd carpet-bomb their lives with the videos again. In the end, the settlement materialized with a resounding finality that reverberated like the slamming of civilization's gates. A lopsided portfolio of decimated trade-offs and forfeited consolations that nonetheless handed me a Pyrrhic victory. The home even transferred to my name, the mortgages consolidated under my loan liability. Even the luxury car she'd brawn purchased with her first ember of midlife mania would be re-reposed into indifferent utility as my pedestrian work commuter. Visitation of the girls would be granted, though their introduction into Sarah's henhouse of newly sowed chaos would remain under my judicious purview. But most importantly, a coda that protracted this grotesquerie into perpetuity was averted. Our ravaged union permitted a period of overdue convalescence from the policies of mutually assured emotional destruction we dealt one another. Those first few weeks inhabited a sort of liminal purgatory, an emotional ice floe having calved away from the glacial schism of my former existence. Each day carried the weightless disorientation of an astronaut momentarily untethered from their parent craft. Waking up to the disquieting silence of a home finally purged of Sarah's spectral pathologies. No more furtive phone whispers bleeding through the drywall like acoustic rodent tunnels. No more evenings whiled away scrutinizing her rituals for the subtlest intimations of infidelity's spread. Gradually, the fog dissipated and glimpses of self-sovereignty materialized. Reminders of a dignity I'd forgotten lingered beneath the contusions. Reclaiming small tokens of autonomy once unassumingly ceded over the years. Rearranging the furniture free of protest. Culling her abandoned totems from bookshelves and cabinets without ceremonial consultation. Each interiorismic shift registered with the satisfying cymbal crash of rebirthed individualism. Yet periodically, fissures would abruptly splinter yoke across the freshly calloused scar tissue. Inescapable echoes zamper-shadowing the marital charnel house, a giggling couple's offhand endearment catching like a fishhook in my throat. A sidelong glance exchanged between paramours, unconsciously mirroring the forsaken language of Sarah and her Lucas. Momentary relapses where the unhealed leakages forth in pungent psychic purges until, at last, the aftershocks subsided into the seismic white noise undergirding this fresh epoch. Like a hermit crab outgrowing its scavenged carapace, I could finally embody the contours of my metamorphosis with growing comfort. As the dust emanating from my scorched earth campaign gradually settled, certain disquieting intrusions began infiltrating the peripheries. Faint ethical static, the muted musings of my subsumed better nature gently rematerializing to sow the insidious seeds of self-reproach. For in unhesitatingly pressing the detonator on Sarah's personal apocalypse, had I not also irrevocably shattered my own ethical bedrock? Forsaken the unimpeachable injunctions woven into the catechistic tone of my childhood evangel in a revanchist pursuit as corrosive as any roadside B0M? The creeping realizations surfaced in increments at first, fleeting premonitions of culpability's penumbra, encroaching in vulnerable moments of solitude and rumination. Sarah's crushed, vacant aspect in those final tribunal appearances began haunting my psychospiritualic reveries with undeniable pathos. Recollections of her youthful, sanguine countenance as the boutique first blossomed into solvency, transposed into the scorched nihility she latterly radiated. The two circularly polarized specters warring for recognition until the latter gradually usurped prominence. Goblinly frantic bubbling upwards with accusatory reminders that I'd meticulously engineered the total ruination of her life's work. And what of Kyle, that hapless Pupican catalyst who'd sauntered so arrogantly into our domestic preflagration? The lawn placards and bilious PR volleys may have branded him career-rated paragon of unrepentant lect, but hadn't my fury tailscast such an enduring, dehubanantic purgatory upon this man that mirrored the doghouse of distress I was so hellbent on springing Sarah from? A potent and humbling truth washed over me in waves, that in egregiously overplaying my hand, I'd surrendered the moral counterweight that had initially grounded my indignation, reduced to howling for forgiveness inversely from alloy of public evisceration I'd so joylessly inflicted. The process of reconstructing one's cores amid the ashen devastation is an alchemical undertaking, sifting through the charred detritus for those few remnant talismans that endured the purge, anchoring philosophical cornerstones to provide the necessary anic foundation. For me, it was the grounding ballast of fatherhood that served as the immovable lodestar orienting my spiritual cartography. The whip-tanned cords binding me to Taylor and Mackenzie represented the sole mooring lines still securely cleated as the rest of my life's cargo was consigned to the depths. Slowly, tentatively, I began the process of extricating their impressionable psyches from the smoldering wreckage. Each afternoon pickup from school, a solemn ushering of their bright-eyed resiliency back into the sanctuary of our Heim. Each evening recounting their diurnal decompressings over a simple home-cooked meal, the banal cadences of domesticity arduously reintegrating to provide pacifying harbors of normalcy. On weekends, immersive excursions out into the pastoral arteries of our region, hikes, museum jaunts, sporting exhibitions awash in the giddy histrionics of squawking adolescence. Gradually, prognostications realigned as their indomitability recalibrated the trajectory. With their well-being stabilized, my personal recentering could finally commence in earnest. A stoic exhumation of the repressed civic-mindedness long smothered under the canopies of commercial and domestic enterprise. Reconnecting with advocacy groups dedicated to combating spousal infidelity and its traumatic reverberations. Sharing my own fraught experiential arc at outreach seminars, then seguing into informal counseling and group facilitation. Leveraging my professional bearings to provide pro bono financial advisement for those refugees of the same scorched emotional terrain still mired in poverty's killing pits. Each incremental contribution instilled a renewed sense of purpose, a rebaptismal of the humanitarian values withering beneath years of accumulating marital scar tissue. The abscesses steadily drained until at last, the path forward became not just illuminated, but inevitably predetermined, a calling to light the way for others stumbling across the same precipice.